you guys. So, by the end of the 18th century, the humanitarian approach gained further strength as few courageous people working in hospitals in France, Scotland, and England, shout out to the whites, began to recognize the inhumanity of the conditions in the poorhouses and monasteries, housing those with psychological disorders. This is really interesting to me as a Latina because I'm like, so this is what happened in Europe. This is European history that, I'm reading as if it's the history of everyone. But what about in the Latina cultures? Like, how did they treat people with psychological disorders? It's just very interesting to me. The idea of moral treatment began to take hold based on the belief that people had a right to humane care and that they would benefit the most in their recovery from a quiet and restful environment. Institutions following this model used restraints only if absolutely necessary. And even in those cases, the patient's comfort came first. Yet again, conditions in the institutions originally formed to protect patients began to worsen in the early 1800s due to overcrowding and the increasing use of physical punishment as a means of control. We're just all crazy out here. In 1841, Boston schoolteacher Dorothy Dix took up the cause of reform, horrified by overcrowding and appalling conditions in the asylums. Dix appealed to the Massachusetts legislature for more state-funded public hospitals to provide humane treatment for mental patients. From Massachusetts, she then spread her message throughout North America and Europe. So right now we're talking about the approaches to psychology throughout history. Started out with spiritual, everything's like demons, evil spirits. In the Middle Ages, of course this is European history, right? I don't know what Latin America's history was. So, then finally, over the next 100 years, governments built scores of state hospitals throughout the United States, so from 1841 and on, following the humanitarian model originally advocated by Dix. Her work was carried forward into the 20th century by advocates of the mental hygiene movement, the goal of which was to improve the care and treatment of people living in mental hospitals. Associated with the mental hygiene movement was an emphasis on preventing the development of psychological disorders through early interventions. Once again, however, it was only a matter of time before the hospitals became overcrowded, and understaffed. So this seems to be a theme in history of where when people try to house people with psychological disorders, eventually it becomes unsafe, overcrowded, things like that. So it simply was not possible to cure people by providing them with the well-intentioned but ultimately ineffective interventions proposed by moral treatment. Public outrage over the worsening situation in mental hospitals eventually led to a more widespread realization that mental health services required dramatic changes. In 1963, the U.S. government took emphatic action with the passage of groundbreaking legislation. The Community Mental Health Act of that year initiated a series of changes that would affect mental health services for decades to come. This legislation paved the way for the deinstitutionalization movement, which was the release of hundreds of thousands of patients from mental hospitals starting in the 1960s. The legislation mandated that people living in mental hospitals be moved into less restrictive programs in the community, such as vocational rehabilitation facilities, day hospitals, and psychiatric clinics. Now we know why the 50s were so uptight. It's like you didn't want to end up in a mental institution. And then everybody got free, and then they got real free, Anyway, by the mid-1970s, state mental hospitals that once overflowed with patients were practically deserted. Hundreds of thousands of institutionally confined people were free to begin living with greater dignity and autonomy. The deinstitutionalization movement did not completely fulfill the dreams of its originators, however. Rather than eliminating inhumane treatment, it created another set of woes. Many of the promises and programs hailed as alternatives to institutionalization ultimately failed to materialize because of inadequate planning and insufficient funds. Patients were shuttled back and forth between hospitals, halfway houses, and shabby boarding homes, never gaining a sense of stability or respect. A great number spend long periods of time as homeless and marginalized members of society. Although the intention behind releasing patients from psychiatric hospitals was to restore basic human rights to those with psychological disorders, the results actually may not have been as liberating as many had hoped. Advocates of the humanitarian movement today suggest new forms of compassionate treatment for people with psychological disorders. The latest approach encourages mental health consumers to take an active role in choosing their treatment. Various advocacy groups have worked tirelessly to change the way the public views people with psychological disorders and the way that society deals with them in all settings. Primary among these groups is the U.S. National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, with its grassroots-based local and regional chapters. The humanitarian approach is also reflected in the positive psychology movement, which emphasizes the potential for growth and change throughout life. The movement views psychological disorders as difficulties that inhibit the individual's ability to achieve highly subjective well-being and feelings of fulfillment. In addition, the positive psychology movement emphasizes health over illness and prevention over intervention. Basically, positive psychology emphasizes the potential for growth and change throughout life. Improvements in mental health care from a human rights perspective have become a central feature of the World Health Organization, intended to ensure access to high quality and affordable care for mental health conditions at a global level by the year 2023. Anyway, let's talk about the scientific approach. Looking next at the scientific approach. So we're talking about how people in history have approached psychological disorders. The most recent one is scientific. It was before humanitarian, and before that was spiritual, okay? So we're now in the scientific approach era. Looking next at the scientific approach, we now return to ancient times when it was the early Greek philosophers who first took a scientific approach to psychological disorders, or trying to understand them. Hippocrates, considered the founder of modern medicine, believed that mental health depended on a balance of the four so-called bodily humors, based on the elements of air, water, fire, and earth. These physical qualities determined all behavior originating from the body. Although his theory itself would eventually be proven wrong, Hippocrates was far ahead of his time in putting forth the notion that mental health reflected factors within the body rather than possession by evil spirits. Several hundred years later, the Roman physician Claudius Galen carried this view of bodily humors forward, also expanding medical knowledge by conducting anatomical studies of the human body. This approach helped to advance the position that diseases have their source in abnormal bodily function. The scientific approach to psychological disorder receded for hundreds of years in favor of explanations rooted in the spiritual perspective. It next emerged in the writings of Dr. Benjamin Rush, 1745 to 1813, the founder of U.S. psychiatry and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Who this guy? Dr. Benjamin Rush. In 1783, Rush joined the medical staff of Pennsylvania Hospital. Appalled by the poor treatment of psychologically disturbed patients there, Rush advocated for improvements such as placing patients in their own wards, giving them occupational therapy, and prohibiting hospital visits by curiosity seekers looking for entertainment. Reflecting the prevailing methods of the times, though, Rush also supported the use of bloodletting and purging in the treatment of psychological disorders, as well as the so-called tranquilizer chair, intended to reduce blood flow to the brain by binding the patient's head and limbs. Rush also recommended submerging patients in cold shower baths and frightening them with death threats. He thought that by inducing fear, he could counteract their sometimes violent behavior. However, even while advancing these seemingly unscientific methods, Rush also advocated for the use of medicinal herbs in treating psychological disorders. These can be seen as precursors to modern pharmacological, scientifically based interventions. The next major advance in the scientific approach occurred in 1844 when a group of 13 mental hospital administrators formed the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. This organization eventually changed its name to the American Psychiatric Association and is now leading internally recognized scientific and professional society. In 1845, the scientific approach received another impetus? How do you pronounce that? With the publication by German psychiatrist Wilhelm Griesinger, The Pathology and Therapy of Mental Disorders. Griesinger proposed that neuropathologies were the cause of psychological disorders, and in so doing, he recognized the role of the nervous system in abnormal behavior. Further advances occurred when German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin promoted a classification system for psychological disorders that paralleled those applied to medical diseases, focusing on documenting the patterns of symptoms associated with specific disorders. Ultimately, this work provided the scientific basis for current diagnostic systems. While these advances in medical science and psychiatry were taking place, the origins of a psychological approach to abnormality began to emerge in the late 1800s, when European physicians experimented with hypnosis for the treatment of people showing symptoms of psychological disorders. Eventually, these efforts led to the groundbreaking work of Viennese neurologist Sigmund Freud, who in the early 1900s developed psychoanalysis, a theory and system of practice based originally in neurology, but ultimately becoming focused on the concepts of the unconscious mind, inhibited sexual impulses, and early development. Freud was a perv, okay, that's what I think, but anyway. Throughout the 20th century, psychologists continued to develop models based on observations of the behavior of laboratory animals. The work of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, known for his discovery of classical conditioning, became the basis for the behaviorist movement begun in the United States by John B. Watson and Skinner. John B. Watson. B.F. Skinner, and this is pretty recent, he was born 1904, died 1990, formulated a systematic approach to operant conditioning, specifying the types and nature of reinforcement and its use as a way to modify behavior. In the 20th century, these models continued to evolve into theories that would have more direct relevance to psychological disorders, including those of Albert Bandura, Aaron Beck, and Albert Ellis. These newer models, along with the integrative models that took a biopsychosocial approach, are leading to promising empirical means evidence-based, ways to understand the causes of psychological disorders. Although not all may prove useful, they will help ensure that our application of a scientific perspective results in treatments that are both humane and scientifically based. Okay, so those have been the three approaches to psychological disorders throughout history. Now let's talk about descriptive research. So let's talk about research methods in abnormal psychology. As you've just learned, the scientific approach led to significant advances in the understanding and treatment of abnormal behavior. The essence of the scientific method is objectivity, the process of testing ideas about the nature of psychological phenomena without bias before accepting these ideas as adequate explanations. The scientific method relies on a progression of steps from posing questions of interest to sharing the results with the scientific community. Throughout their application of the scientific method, researchers maintain the objectivity that is the hallmark of the scientific approach. This means they do not let their personal biases interfere with the collection of data or the interpretation of their findings. They remain open to alternate explanations that could account for their findings. Toward this end, researchers are now making their data available in open access repositories that allow other scientists to examine their procedures, analysis, and conclusions. Although the scientific method is based on objectivity, this doesn't mean that scientists have no personal interest in what they're studying. In fact, many researchers pursue knowledge in areas that relate to their own lives, particularly in the field of abnormal psychology. Ding, ding, ding. They may have relatives afflicted with certain disorders, or they may have developed this interest through their clinical work. Regardless of what motivated them to study a particular topic, researchers in abnormal psychology must maintain their distance and be able to look at their findings without bias. In posing questions of interest, psychological researchers may wonder whether a particular kind of experience led to an individual's symptoms, or they may speculate about the role of particular biological factors. Clinical psychologists are also interested in finding out whether a certain treatment will effectively manage the symptoms of a disorder. In either case, the ideal approach is to progress through the scientific method steps, in which the researcher proposes a hypothesis, conducts a study, collects the data, and performs empirical analysis of the data. When this phase has been completed, researchers communicate results by publishing them in scientific journals, ideally after obtaining peer review to ensure the study's validity. Okay, so experimental research. Experimental design. In the experimental approach to scientific research, an investigator sets up a test of a hypothesis to determine whether one variable or factor influences a second variable. The experimental method is the only approach that can test cause and effect because it allows investigators to change the variable A to see how this affects the variable B. So it's the only experiment that basically determines causation. For example, the investigator may wish to determine whether a particular form of therapy reduces anxiety levels in people seeking treatment. The investigator then provides some people with therapy and other people with no therapy. In this case, therapy is the independent variable, which is the variable that's adjusted or controlled by the experimenter. The experimental group receives the treatment, and the control group receives no treatment. The level of anxiety people report serves as the dependent variable, which is the variable whose value is the outcome of the experimenter's manipulation of the independent variable. The investigator may hope that the anxiety levels of the participants decrease more in the experimental than the control group if they're both compared before and after treatment. But the study cannot determine what those levels of anxiety will be. Depending on the nature of the particular study, there may be more than one experimental group. For example, an investigator may want to compare two different treatments against each other, evaluating both in comparison to a third control group. In that case, the independent variable takes on three values: treatment 1, treatment 2, and no treatment. The gold standard for research in clinical psychology is the randomized control trial, an experimental method in which participants are randomly assigned to intervention groups. The key to this method is to use randomization, which minimizes the chances that bias can enter into the decision about which participants receive which treatment. Because this is such a powerful design, RCT is the foundation for evidence-based treatment, in which clients receive intervention based on findings of controlled clinical studies. Placebo condition. The placebo condition is a condition in an experiment in which participants receive a treatment similar to the experimental treatment, but lacking the key feature of the treatment of interest. Placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial is an experimental method in which participants are randomly assigned a placebo versus treatment group. A double-blind experiment. That's an experimental procedure in which neither the person giving the treatment nor the person receiving the treatment knows whether the participant is an experimental or control group, so nobody knows. Correlational design. It's a study in which researchers test the relationships between variables that they cannot experimentally manipulate. So what kinds of research studies are there? There are surveys. It's a research tool used to gather information from a sample of people considered representative of a particular population, in which participants are asked to answer questions about the topic of concern. Incidence is the frequency of new cases within a given time period. Like the incidence of a disorder is the frequency of new cases within a given time period. Respondents providing incidence data state whether they now have a disorder they have never had before and are experiencing for the first time. Incidence information can cover any time interval. Epidemiologists tend to report it in terms of 1 month, 6 months, and 1 year. Investigators use incidence data when they are interested in determining how quickly a disorder is spreading. For example, during an epidemic, health researchers need to know how to plan for controlling the disease, and incidence data are most pertinent to this question. Prevalence. The number of people who have ever had a disorder at a given time or over a specified period of time. To collect prevalence data, investigators ask respondents to state whether, during this period of time, they experienced the symptoms of the disorder. The time period of reference can be the day of the survey, in which case we will call it the point prevalence. There is also 1 month prevalence, which refers to the 30 days preceding the study, and the lifetime prevalence, which refers to the entire life of the respondent. For example, researchers may ask respondents whether they smoked cigarettes at any time during the past month. That's a 1 month prevalence. Or whether they ever used cigarettes in their lifetime. That's a lifetime prevalence. Typically, lifetime prevalence is higher than 1 month, or point prevalence, because the question captures all past experiences of a disorder or a symptom. Epidemiological research can also discover the frequency of coexisting disorders, a situation referred to as comorbidity, which literally means these diagnoses co-occur within the same individual. Diagnoses of comorbidity are remarkably common. The National Comorbidity Survey, conducted in the United States between 1990 and 1992, documented the extent to which psychiatric diagnoses co-occur in the general population. Oh! Babe, what the fuck? That was weird. What? What, babe? You just want to say hi? What's that? Oh my god, I'm sorry. My husband scared the shit out of me. Anyway, data from the, You guys, I can't focus now. Anyway, we're almost done with this chapter. You want to cheers, babe?
That's a Mrs. I believe. This was right. That's a Mrs.
Cheers, babe. You guys looking cute.
Cheers to starting our life together. Well, starting our life together.
To a lifetime of happiness.
To sharing our life together.
Okay. Yeah, it's not like a downy kind of drink. It's like
It was good at first, and then the aftertaste.
just gotta let it bubble. Did you know
It's good in small sips.
that doing drugs or basically drinking, it can lower your grade by a whole, it can lower your scores of studying or whatever by a whole grade. It can affect your, see, it's already affecting you.
I believe it. I went to college.
You want me to read to you?
Yeah.
Okay, I gotta continue then.
I think I should go home soon.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Okay, I'll talk to you guys later.